Hey everybody, Rob from Karma Comment Chameleon. Today we're looking at a couple of pro-revenge stories. First one, don't want to pay compensation? Enjoy paying way more in legal fees. Let's jump right in. A few years ago, my mother ran a rest home business with a lady who had a background in nursing. My mother is an immigrant with barely proficient English, so she was happy for someone to take care of the business side of things while she managed the people side, looking after the residents, all elderly Chinese, and dealing with the families. Everything was okay for the first few years until the business partner slowly revealed herself to be a Karen. My mother wanted the best for the residents and hired a chef to cook traditional Chinese meals for them. If residents were moved to hospital care, she would still come visit them and bring them food and gifts. Karen would piggyback on this and pretend the gifts were from her when she never spent a cent. She didn't like spending a lot of money on good quality food, so she started reducing the chef's hours to make her quit. The chef asked for one day off a week so she could go to church, and Karen would deliberately schedule her for work on that day. When the chef complained, Karen told her, "Why don't you pray to God about it?" We found out later that she was also abusive to some of the residents. She did this selectively, preying on the ones who suffered from dementia and couldn't report her. The chef found her dumping away the vegetables she prepared for one resident and pouring just some vegetable juices on rice instead. When she criticized Karen about this, she was made redundant. Fortunately, she was able to make an employment claim and received compensation. Karen's own mother was also a resident there until her dementia worsened and she was moved to hospital care. She was physically and verbally abusive to her own mother, often yelling at her to hurry up and just f***ing die. She was also taking money out of the business account for maintenance and never providing any receipts for work done. It looked like she was trying to polish the place up before pushing my mother out of the business, as she refused to sell to other buyers and offered to buy my mother's share at a way lower price than what others were prepared to pay. A lot of the staff were Chinese students, and Karen knew she could bully them without repercussion. Anyone who disagreed with her would get moved to the graveyard shift or let go. People would eventually quit because of the bullying, and she quickly ran out of competent staff, so she started letting untrained staff administer medication and unlicensed staff drive residents to doctor's appointments. My mother freaked out when she found out about this and reported her to the health board. Karen received a letter from the board asking her to respond to the complaint. She immediately went and found herself a lawyer, who I will kindly refer to as Greedy Hag. Greedy Hag advised Karen that the best way to get rid of this problem was to remove my mother as a director. She sought to rely on legislation without first reviewing any of the company documents. If she had read the shareholders agreement, she would have realized that even though Karen had 60% of the shareholding, she needed 80% to remove my mother. So out of nowhere, my mother receives an email from Karen inviting her to attend a meeting to have herself removed as a director. She then sees through the company's bank account that money has been paid to Greedy Hag. It seemed like she was paying to have herself fired. She doesn't know at this point that none of this was allowed and calls me in a panic. I tell her to lawyer up, and we write to Greedy Hag advising her that as this was shareholders' dispute matter, and seeing as she was acting for Karen, she couldn't bill the company for her time. Greedy Hag writes back to us saying she doesn't represent Karen, she's only acting in the best interests of the company and will continue acting for the company. This goes back and forth for an excruciatingly long period. They start to accuse my mother of verbally harassing Karen and creating a hostile environment for the staff and residents, basically turning the entire story around and blaming everything on my mother. They referred to my mother's complaint as exceptionally minor issues, isolated incidents that somehow paradoxically created an existential threat to the company. You know, Schrodinger's complaint. It was clear that our protests would not be enough, and Greedy Hag continued to bill fees to the company, so we lodged a complaint to the Law Society. Our complaint was 1 paragraph long. The lawyer's response, over 200 pages. It was obvious that she wanted to bury us in paperwork, and she continued to emphasize in her response what a terribly incompetent director my mother was, and how Karen was the victim of my mother's destructive attempt to harm the company, and the company desperately required her counsel to protect its interests. What Karen didn't know at this point was that I am also a lawyer. Mind you, I don't do litigation, and we hired separate counsel to deal with the actual dispute. Most of what I do is pointless paper shuffling bureaucracy, but like all lawyers, I can be petty. So I spent weeks painstakingly sifting through all her nonsense, helping my mother respond to every unfounded allegation and throwing shade at every opportunity. The committee agreed with us, describing her explanation as disingenuous, irreconcilable with evidence, implausible, completely nonsensical, underhanded, misleading, and extremely concerning from a professional standards perspective. They said Greedy Hag was hopelessly conflicted in her dealings and was absolutely scathing in their deliberation. It was beautiful. Greedy Hag was ordered to pay a small fine, costs, and $2,500 compensation. She appealed this decision, presumably because she has numerous complaints against her already and can't risk another strike of unsatisfactory conduct, and hired the most expensive barrister she could, someone who used to sit on the committee and prosecuted on legal disciplinary cases. The slightly depressing part is, she managed to get the decision overturned, although everyone who has read it has called it incomprehensible and reeking of bribery. They reasoned that the lawyer wasn't responsible for issuing paperwork to remove my mother as a director because Karen wrote my mother's name in, and that happened after she left the office, so it had nothing to do with the lawyer's flawless logic. The consolation is that her legal fees must have ended up somewhere around $30,000, as I forced her legal team to read pages and pages of insults describing her legal advice as not worth the paper it was printed on. P.S. All the staff members fired by Karen showed up to support my mother, forcing her to settle, as the alternative was to sell to a third party. It was very satisfying to watch her cry as we walked out of the arbitration. So Greedy Hag could have settled for $2,500 compensation, but she decided to fight it and ended up paying $30,000 in legal fees. It sounds from the comments like OP's mom eventually did get bought out, and for the price that she originally wanted. On to our next story. Make my life at work miserable, you'll never work again with me. Let's jump right in. I used to work at a medium-sized IT services company and had recently been moved to a smaller branch office with a nice pay raise. I was basically my own team and got to do interesting work on a large project. Since they were satisfied with the work, but needed it done on a larger scale, the company hired another person to help me. Meet Fred. I knew Fred from outside work through common relationships, and I didn't find him any weirder than other nerdy people in the business. Oh boy. Fred was good at technical work, very good. When it came to human interactions though, it was something else. Fred thought of me as his only friend in the workplace and would bitch all day long about other colleagues who were all equally incompetent, weird, evil, and generally deserving of his scorn. Fred had a terrible tendency of telling other people we had to work with that they were doing things wrong and that their software was crap, which was often technically right, but completely forgetting the constraints in which other people had to work and that there might have been reasons for things that now sounded awful, which is basically always the case in IT. People resented both of us as a team for things he said, and some situations became entrenched. It was getting harder every day for me to get to work. Eventually, he made a lot of enemies and he got a meeting with the division director. It only lasted for a few minutes, during which he told the boss of 800 people that he was an evildoer. It was his last day in the company. I worked alone from that time and managed to finish most of the project, soothing things over with other teams. A few months later, I got an offer for the job of my dreams in a huge utility company. After starting the work, guess who I discover working right here as a contractor under my direct supervision? Fred. Fred looked so happy to find a friend again. He spent most of my first day at work telling me how the company was awful, everyone was dumb, and everything was insufferable. I went home that night feeling horrible, wondering how much of what he told me was true and how bad it would be to work there. Turns out, After a few hard starting days, it really was the job of my dreams. Acting now with Fred as a client and not a colleague, I managed to keep him in check and to improve a lot of the perceived quality of the team's work. Prior to my hiring, Fred was basically telling people to f*** off whenever they were asking him things he didn't want to work on. Having someone who could see through his bullshit to manage him got the roadmap back on track. Eventually, I learned that my colleagues had been very wary about working with me at the beginning because Fred had been bad-mouthing me from the day he learned I had been hired to manage him. This had made the first weeks difficult until they understood he had been lying about it all. About 2 years later, I was now team manager and my boss comes in my office and asks me about a hiring issue. There's a new position in the team and the recruiter asked him about someone with excellent technical skills but who sounded very arrogant. Guess who wanted to work as my colleague again? If you've followed the story, you've got it right. I did not let out to my boss the slightest bit of resentment. I explained to him how he was a very competent person, but that he might just lack a bit of the skills required for our company's teamwork. I knew exactly what I had to say for my boss to never want to hire him, ever, without making it about our personal history. I only told what happened to a close coworker, and he sounded very thankful to hear that he would not have to work with Fred as a colleague. A few months later, his company lost the contract and Fred was hired by the new contractor. However, they were not as lenient with him as the previous company was, and another few months later, I was finally Fred free. Last I heard of him, he was working at a Silicon Valley giant on a project that was in a worldwide media storm over technical issues. I keep wondering whether he was telling everyone else in his team how bad at their job they were and how much he contributed to that massive failure. I think every company has a Fred, someone who absolutely despises being at work every day, talks down the company, and makes it just a generally miserable place to be. I've definitely experienced that a few times in my working history, and I'm sure you all have too. I'd love to hear your stories of various Freds in the comments below. I want to thank both of the OPs for posting their stories to the ProRevenge subreddit. You can visit them at the links in the description below. Please go there and give them an upvote. Once again, this is Rob from Karma Comic Chameleon saying thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share it with your friends, and we'll see you in the next one.